I noticed it first in the body, not in the photographs. In photographs, the staircases looked grand, theatrical, even beautiful in the ordinary old-world way. But climbing them produced a different impression. The rise asked too much. The tread interrupted ordinary rhythm. The width seemed designed for more movement than the building now had reason to carry. At first, I took that as another flourish of monumental architecture. The longer I looked, the less convincing that became. Decoration drifts with taste. These proportions often did not. They returned with a strange discipline, as though the staircase was not an ornament at all, but a preserved instruction. What unsettled me first was not their appearance, but their insistence in the body. In photographs, old staircases often read as pageantry. They look like theater rendered in stone, the usual monumental grammar of institutions that wished to be admired, feared, or obeyed. But the body reaches a different conclusion. The rise feels just a little too demanding. The tread interrupts an ordinary step. The width suggests more movement than the surviving function seems to require. You notice the strain before you find the language for it, and once that sensation has been felt clearly enough, the staircase stops behaving like scenery. It begins to behave like a clue. We are told, of course, that such forms were built to impress. There is truth in that, as far as it goes. Buildings have always used scale to produce emotion. A courthouse can enlarge itself to manufacture authority. A station can exaggerate its dimensions to dignify movement. A museum, a ministry, a hospital, even a school of sufficient ambition can use proportion to make the visitor feel the institution before understanding it. But the explanation becomes less stable the longer one looks. Display usually concentrates itself at the point of encounter. It announces itself at entries, facades, vestibules, and ceremonial axes. What is strange about many giant staircases is that their scale often continues beyond those symbolic thresholds, into circulation paths, secondary halls, intermediate landings, and internal routes where movement appears to matter more than spectacle. That distinction matters more than it first appears. A flourish can be isolated. A standard repeats. And what recurs in so much older civic and institutional architecture is not simply one grand stair meant to impress a crowd on arrival. It is enlarged ascent embedded in the building's practical logic. Broad flights where narrower ones would have served known traffic. High risers repeated across floors. Landings that feel less like pauses than platforms. Open wells sized for visibility, turning movement. Or processional flow on a scale that feels subtly excessive now. Place enough examples side by side, and the emotional reading begins to weaken. What first appeared expressive starts to feel compliant, as though these structures were obeying an inherited assumption about the body moving through them. The official comfort is that the assumption was aesthetic, but aesthetics drift. They move with patrons, regions, budgets, ideologies, materials, and fashion. What unsettles me is not that one architect chose grandeur. It is the stiffness with which similar oversized proportions recur across building types, not united by the same symbolic purpose. A railway station is not trying to say exactly what a courthouse says. A hospital administration block does not perform the same emotional task as a museum rotunda. Yet stairways of comparable, exaggerated scale appear in all of them. Not everywhere, but often enough to suggest that the expected user had been imagined before style began decorating the surface. You start noticing where these stairs are placed, not only beneath chandeliers, painted ceilings, or domes, where later explanation can always invoke theater, but in axial corridors, municipal approaches, archive routes, side vestibules, and practical vertical connections that appear designed for repeated use. In some buildings, The monumental stair is not a singular event. It is one instance in a sequence. The same enlarged geometry reappears deeper inside, sometimes stripped of ornament, sometimes simplified almost to plainness, but still demanding the same bodily adjustment. That is difficult to explain as mere spectacle. Spectacle spends itself where it can be seen. Repeated scale in working passages suggests something more disciplined, more procedural, less interested in impression than in fit. I do not mean that every large staircase proves the existence of a vanished human type. That would be too easy, and it would claim more than the structures themselves can safely support. The point is narrower than that, and to me, more persuasive. These buildings often preserve a practical relationship to movement that no longer sits comfortably with the bodies using them now. Modern standards compress effort. They economize ascent. They regularize motion around present assumptions of convenience, liability, and efficiency. Many older staircases feel calibrated by another expectation, one in which the anticipated stride, burden, procession, or user was not identical to ours. Once that possibility enters the frame, small details begin to change meaning. A railing added later at an awkward height no longer looks like neutral maintenance. It can read as accommodation, a landing cut by partitions, a central run narrowed, an extra handrail inserted, a tread resurfaced, a rise softened during repair, all begin to point in the same direction. The old geometry remained, but later users tried to negotiate with it, not through one decisive redesign, through accumulated compromise. Buildings often preserve the history of change bodies more honestly than the narratives written around them. This is why comparison matters so much. One staircase can be dismissed as ambition, two can be called fashion, but after enough examples. Across cities, functions, and jurisdictions, the ornamental explanation begins to carry too much strain. You see flights too wide for present traffic, steps too tall for ease, voids too generous for ordinary circulation, and alignments that imply movement in volume rather than movement in comfort. The architecture keeps hinting at another ergonomic expectation. Not fantasy, not yet. Something more difficult than that, a built assumption about who or what kind of daily life these spaces were meant to receive. A staircase is never only an image. It is a machine for distributing effort through the body over time. Each rise asks something. Each tread grants or withholds something. Each landing gathers, interrupts, redirects, or stages motion. Change those dimensions and the building changes with them. A person of ordinary height can still climb an oversized stair, just as a bent key can still enter a lock. But the fit is no longer clean. The body shortens, reaches, leans, compensates. Multiply that across an institution and across decades of daily use, and the staircase begins to read less like decoration than like a fossil of another measure. That is where the question sharpens. We may not be looking at theatrical excess at all. We may be looking at a preserved specification whose intended rhythm, intended burden, or intended user no longer belongs fully to the world that inherited it. The problem is that buildings survive a change in explanation more easily than almost anything else. Stone remains, iron remains, routes of ascent remain. But the language that once made those forms legible can disappear almost completely. And when that happens, later generations inherit structures they can still use without understanding why those structures were shaped the way they were. The staircase remains climbable. That preserves continuity of use. It does not preserve continuity of meaning. A thing can remain functional long after its original specification has been forgotten. And once that forgetting hardens into habit, the official story begins arranging itself around the smaller uses that survived instead of the larger purpose that was lost. This is one reason older institutions are so often described in visual language. We are told what style they belong to, what period they represent, what decorative movement influenced them, what values they projected. All of that may be true in part, but style language often enters precisely where operational language has failed. It tells us how a building looked to later observers, not necessarily what its proportions were originally solving. The staircase becomes grandeur. The oversized doorway becomes pomp. The ceiling height becomes civic confidence. Architecture, once stripped of its working logic, is frequently placed inside the museum case of aesthetics, because aesthetics are easier to preserve than unanswered specifications. That is the movement I keep returning to, not from truth to falsehood in any dramatic sense, but from precision to vagueness. The old world may have built with measurements answering to a practical logic, then passed into history through categories too soft to preserve that logic intact. Once a building is renamed, repurposed, restored, subdivided, or adapted to a smaller routine, each later intervention nudges explanation in the same direction. The structure remains, but the reason for its scale is translated into safer words. Grandeur, monumentality, prestige, spectacle. These words are not always wrong. They are often incomplete. They explain the emotional effect of the surviving shell. They do not explain why so many practical structures were given geometries that presume more body, more load, more procession, or more tolerance for exertion than current use appears to justify. And once a culture grows used to living among inherited forms it no longer fully understands, a second process begins. Adaptation becomes normal. Railings are inserted. Intermediate levels are added. Platforms are flattened. Steps are repaired in ways that soften old rises or interrupt old runs. Narrower routes are preferred. Certain passages are closed. Others are reclassified as ceremonial because they no longer suit efficient daily traffic. In time, the altered building becomes the building people think they know. The original geometry survives only in fragments, or in those neglected corners where modernization did not quite finish its work. The evidence remains, but it speaks quietly. It has to be noticed, compared, reconstructed. Their silence does not feel like refutation. Refutation leaves traces. It leaves argument, rejection, a record of why an earlier assumption failed. What surrounds many of these oversized forms is something else. They are simply accepted as given. Their oddness is absorbed into heritage language, admiration, tourism, routine. The question that should follow them is never formally forbidden. It is simply not treated as serious. Why this rise, this width, this repeated scale here as well as there, in buildings not united by the same ceremony? Why does the explanation remain so small in the face of the form itself? I keep returning to the body because the body is where architecture becomes honest. A guidebook can reduce. A plaque can misdirect. A facade can flatter. But stairs negotiate directly with weight, balance, breath, rhythm, and effort. They reveal what sort of movement a building expected to receive. A staircase built for a shorter step feels different from one built for a longer step. A staircase built for light traffic feels different from one shaped for heavy passage. A staircase intended for occasional display feels different from one assuming recurrent use at scale. The body does not solve the mystery by itself. It does something more modest and, for that reason, more useful. It narrows the field of acceptable explanations. That narrowing matters because it keeps the question from collapsing into caricature. To ask who these staircases were built for is not necessarily to leap into fantasy. It is to take the structures seriously enough to believe they may preserve a real ergonomic assumption, unlike the one now governing public life. Perhaps the intended user was physically larger. Perhaps the movement pattern involved burdens, garments, tools, or ritual forms that altered the required stride. Perhaps the circulation belonged to institutions whose daily operation demanded a different relationship between ascent, visibility, and throughput. Perhaps several of these things were true at once. What matters first is not the final answer. What matters is recognizing that the official explanation may simply be too general for the specificity of the evidence. The longer I look, the less persuaded I am by the claim that these staircases were built merely to make ordinary people feel small. That effect exists, but it reads to me as secondary, almost like a later interpretation extracted from a surviving shell. If intimidation were the true purpose, it would not need to recur with such discipline in internal routes and practical transitions. Intimidation can be staged once. Standards repeat because they are meant to work. And these staircases, for all their strangeness now, often look as though they were once expected to work naturally, repeatedly, without comment, for people moving through them in a way that no longer belongs to us. So, the real mystery is not only size, it is inheritance. What human measure, what institutional routine, what lost physical standard remains embedded in these steps like a fossil in stone? Who climbed them without feeling the resistance we feel now? Who turned those landings without sensing excess? What form of daily life made these proportions seem not dramatic but ordinary? The structures are still here. The rises remain. The widths remain. The burden of explanation remains. And until that burden is met with, something better than admiration, the staircase will continue to stand in plain sight as evidence of a user history preserved physically and forgotten conceptually. That may be the most unsettling possibility of all, not that the evidence vanished, but that it remained usable enough to survive while its meaning was steadily reduced. We still climb the steps. We still photograph them. We still admire them. We no longer know with confidence whom they were made to fit.